Good afternoon. My name is Rebecca Kirkpatrick, and I'm one of the pastors here at Bryn Mawr Presbyterian Church. I'm so grateful to be able to welcome you to this webinar today as a part of our annual Theologian in Residence lectures, established in honor of the ministry of the Reverend Dr. David Watermolder and his wife, Ruth Watermolder, who served this church faithfully from 1962 through 1986. Established in 1988, these lectures are intended to both celebrate excellence in scholarship, but also call the church to more deeply engage with the world through the lens of scripture, through theology, and ethics. Just some of the scholars who've helped us to maintain this tradition in the past include Walter Brueggemann, Peter Gomes, John Dominic Crossan, Catherine Sackenfeld, Diana Eck, Brian Blount, Patrick Miller, Miroslav Volf, and Serene Jones. This year's Theologian in Residence, Jonathan Walton, rightly joins this list of distinguished scholars. Dr. Jonathan L Walton is the Dean of the Divinity School at Wake Forest in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Trained as a social ethicist focusing on evangelical Christianity, his work and insights have been featured in national and international news outlets. His 2018 book, A Lens of Love, Reading the Bible and Its World for Our World, published by Westminster John Knox Press, blends his work from the pulpit and classroom. A Lens of Love explores the Bible from the perspective of the most vulnerable and violated characters towards developing a Christian social ethic of radical inclusion and human affirmation. Just last week, Westminster John Knox Press also re-released the Reinhold Niebuhr classic, Leaves from the Notebook of a Tamed Cynic, for which Dr. Walton has also written a new introduction. Dr. Walton earned his doctorate of philosophy and Master of Divinity degrees from Princeton Theological Seminary. He served as the Plummer Professor of Christian Morals and the Pusey Minister in the Memorial Church at Harvard University prior to his appointment at Wake Forest. Along with serving as the Dean of the School of Divinity, Dr. Walton also occupies the Presidential Chair in Religion and Society and is the inaugural Dean of Waite Chapel at Wake Forest. Welcome, Dr. Walton. We are so grateful to have you with us this afternoon. For our webinar today, we will also be joined by 3 local scholars and church leaders who we have invited to be in conversation with Dr. Walton after his presentation. Dr. Anthea Butler is Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She's the author of a newly released book by UNC Press, White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America, a critical examination of the deep connections between the evangelical movement and racism and how that has shaped American politics for over a century. She's also the author of Women in the Church of God in Christ, Making a Sanctified World, and is currently working on a new project, Reading Race, how publishing created a lifeline for Black Baptists in post-Reconstruction America. A historian of African American and American religion, Professor Butler's research and writing spans African American religion and history, race, politics, evangelicalism, gender and sexuality, media, and popular culture. The Reverend Stephen Lawrence is the administrative assistant to the pastor at White Rock Baptist Church. He serves as the Minister of Adult Programming and Technology there. In addition to his work at White Rock, Reverend Lawrence plans, staffs, and teaches the monthly learning conferences of the West Philadelphia Baptist Congress of Christian Education. He's on the design team and faculty for the Church of Christian Compassion School of Ministry. Reverend Lawrence has served as an adjunct faculty member of Palmer Theological Seminary in its School of Christian Ministry since 1992. He's a board member of the Metropolitan Christian Council of Philadelphia and chairs its education committee. Reverend Lawrence also serves as board chair for NewCore, the New Conversation on Race and Ethnicity. From 2008 to the present, NewCore hosts a multi-ethnic, interfaith, and intergenerational monthly gathering that engages in honest conversations about race in America. Now, I'm not going to mention anybody else's spouses, but Reverend Lawrence did make sure that I knew that he is married to Cheryl Baker Lawrence, and tomorrow, May 3rd, is their 40th wedding anniversary. So, Reverend Lawrence, we appreciate you being here with us on this weekend of celebration. Finally, the Reverend Eustacia Moffett Marshall is the pastor of the newly formed New River Presbyterian Church here in Philadelphia. which represents the union of 3 historic congregations in West Philadelphia, including First African, Calvin, and Good Shepherd Presbyterian churches. Prior to her pastoral tenure in Philadelphia, Reverend Marshall served churches in New Jersey and North Carolina. She is a lectionary commentator on the online African American lectionary and has sermons published in the African American pulpit and in the These Sisters Can Say It, Volume 2. She earned a Master of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary, where I will also mention among her numerous awards, she was the recipient of the David B. Watermolder Award in Church Leadership. Reverend Marshall is currently a PhD candidate at North Carolina A&T State University in the Leadership Studies and Adult Education program, where her research explores the intersection between stigma consciousness and vocational interests of Black women in the church. We are so grateful to all 3 of you for spending this afternoon with us and look forward to your contribution to our conversations today. Just one more note before I offer a prayer and then turn all of this over to Dr. Walton. We've enabled the Q&A function for the webinar today, so you are invited to submit questions through that during the presentation and conversations, and we will get to as many of those as we can. It's become our tradition that we open these lectures with a prayer from Dr. Watermolder. Our prayer for this morning was one that he either wrote late Saturday night or Sunday morning, October 21st, 1973. This was the morning after the events in the Nixon White House that would come to be known as the Saturday Night Massacre and the resignation of the Attorney General and Assistant Attorney General. In Dr. Watermolder's prayer, you can hear his concerns for our nation and his hope in God, a prayer that still feels relevant today. Will you pray with me? Great God of power and might, who has seen empires rise and fall, nations come and go, we turn to you today in humble hope and prayer. Our resources have run out. Our cleverness has overtaken us. Our great ideas lie shattered. Our beloved land stands in turmoil. Lord God of hosts, be with us. Make your face to shine upon us and be gracious to us. Show us the way of life. We know the words of the prophet. What does the Lord require of us? But to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. O Lord of all life, we pray for the capacity to do these things, to blend justice with mercy, and to walk humbly before you. In this day of national crisis, we commend to you our executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government, and all those who are in charge and authority. We put ourselves in your hands with clear heads and calm emotion, that we may be instruments of forces and powers far greater than ourselves. We pray not only for our nation, but for every individual who has a special need, especially for those of our number who are sick, who face decisions, who are at a turning point, and who must decide whether you are the God they worship or whether they worship their self-devised gods instead. Have mercy on us all, O God, and love us that we may love you and so love one another. Through Christ, whose love took him to the cross and whose sacrifice brought our redemption and hope. Amen. Dr. Walton, welcome to our time together.
Thank you so much, Reverend Kirkpatrick. And thank you so much to the people of Bryn Mawr Presbyterian Church. I mean, I hate that this pandemic precludes me from being there with you physically today. That it precludes me from sharing face to face with you underscores a sense of loss that I know that we've all felt over the past 14 months, in addition to the incredible loss of human life born of this pandemic. We all grieve today. And while the tools of advanced technologies have mitigated our sense of disconnect to a degree, and I'm thankful for technological innovation, but I also know now more than ever that God designed us to be in physical community one with another. Human touch, laughter, shared meals, shared sorrow, constitute the core of who we are as human beings, the core of who we are as members of the household of faith. Add to this that I missed the opportunity to share air with these extraordinary professional colleagues that you've brought together this afternoon. A chance to reconnect with old friends, Pastor Eustacia Marshall and Dr. Anthea Butler, and a chance to learn from the Reverend Stephen Lawrence. Just a few weeks ago, I'll share, Anthea Butler and I were texting, and I was getting somewhat misty-eyed as we were watching each other on PBS documentary. And we realized then that this may be the longest period in a few decades that we have gone, Professor Butler and I, as well as several others of our colleagues, that we've gone without seeing one another face to face, sharing family time together. And me having the joy of hearing Anthea Butler telling me she's gonna knock me upside my head in our ongoing playful sibling rivalry that we've shared for decades. So listen, thank you, Bryn Mawr. Thank you for bringing us all together in this way and for this opportunity to live, learn, and love together. Also, let me say this. I'd also like to thank you for your support of Wake Forest University School of Divinity by inviting me to participate in this and be your theologian in residence. You are physically, materially supporting the School of Divinity. I mean, at Wake Divinity, we're committed to fostering agents of justice, reconciliation, and compassion. We're developing architects of hope, equity, and healing, like our dear brother Frank, one of our fine graduates who's now on your staff. So by supporting Wake Divinity, you're also supporting your congregation and many others like it. To be sure, at Wake Forest, we are Baptist in tradition, ecumenical in our constitution and outlook. And as one with, as I shared with you yesterday, with Methodist and Baptist roots, yet trained in the Reformed tradition at Princeton, I know the value and gift of denominational diversity. But regardless of the theological tradition, I also know that it's only what we do for those on the margins of society that matters. For this is our call. This is our commitment as followers of Christ. And this is why I consider it such a privilege to be here with such significant Christian leaders, again, like Reverend Marshall, Reverend Lawrence, my dear sister, Dr. Butler. It's why I consider it a privilege to serve as the Dean of Wake Forest University School of Divinity. And it's why I consider it an honor to fellowship with communities like Bryn Mawr Presbyterian. Because I realize by us supporting one another, we are also supporting our own interests in developing thoughtful, learned, ethically responsible Christians that are committed to doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly before God together. So thank you. I am going to share my screen for my presentation this afternoon. My presentation entitled, The Narcissism of Minor Differences. The Narcissism of Minor Differences. A gospel challenge to purity, rank, and hierarchy. The scripture lesson comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 4, verses 1 through 9. Now, Jesus learned that the Pharisees heard he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact, it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now he had gone through Samaria So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. And then a Samaritan woman came to draw water. And Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into town to buy food. And the Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Narcissism of minor differences. Bryn Mawr, a few years ago, an Episcopal congregation down in my neck of the woods in Davidson, North Carolina, caused a brouhaha in their community. The congregation purchased a life-size bronze statue that's come to be known as Homeless Jesus. The statue depicts curled up on a park bench with a blanket covering hands and head. And the only clue that reveals that this is Jesus, wounds on his feet. The church's rector felt that the statue ought to serve as a constant reminder. It would reflect the church's social justice commitments. An aim of our faith is to express itself in the active concern for the marginalized, the least, the left out, the left behind. The rector of the church, however, didn't expect to receive such a backlash. One neighbor wrote a local paper saying that the image, quote unquote, creeps him out. Others protested that it ought to be removed. There was even a woman who mistook the statue for a real person sleeping on the park bench in front of the church and called the police. Yep, the woman called the police on Jesus. And this woman, when pressed, she didn't back down. She actually said, "This is not who Jesus is. Jesus is not a vagrant. Jesus is not a helpless person who needs our help. We need somebody who's capable of meeting our needs, not somebody who is needy," the woman said. Well, whether we realize it or not, debates in this 21st century town of North Carolina share much in common with cultural debates that extend back to ancient Palestine and the life of Jesus. The gentleman who used the language, "This creeps me out," he wasn't just being sophomoric or puerile in his description. He was actually capturing and conveying a visceral cultural phenomenon that has held purchase in every community since time immemorial. It's called purity politics. We call it politics because it's based on competing conceptions of what a society understands or deems to be clean or dirty. Even if we don't use the exact terms clean or dirty or pure or impure, other terms can still connote purity politics whenever they establish a standard or norm from which all else or all others are measured. It's whatever we establish as normative or pure, from which we juxtapose as lesser or deviant or alternative. Imagine, for example, that we deem as orthodox, straight, legal, clean, righteous, all American. Every culture, this is how we categorize people. This is how we create physical boundaries, and it's even how we establish a social pecking order. Our views of purity and defilement determine who we are and what belongs where. Often factors such as economic status, race, citizenship, and sexuality inform our judgments. Purity politics is about space and place. It's about categorization, who and what belongs where. It's about what and who we privilege. It's about what and who we repel. Purity politics is about what and who we embrace and brings us comfort versus what and who we feel we need to contain and control. Well, ancient Palestine provides us with an example of this dynamic. There were many cultural pressures impinging on Judaism at the turn of the first century, right at the turn of the millennium. There was a strict political and economic hierarchy resulting from imperialism in the region. Jews, for all intents and purposes, were colonized subjects. Local leaders who seemingly cooperated with Rome curried favor and resources for themselves. And with imperialism also came a fear of cultural domination. Hellenization, also known as the spread of Greek culture, was a source of extreme anxiety throughout the region for generations. And for a people who prided themselves on distinctiveness due to their faith, Hellenization proved a formidable threat. Fear of cultural domination often causes religious leaders to circle the wagons around a community. Religious communities erect high walls of division between us and them and hold their own community members to impossible standards of behavior. And more often than not, the alienated and marginalized are marked as symptomatic carriers of cultural decline. The poor, the powerless, and the perceived aliens become easily identifiable representative of all that's wrong in a society. So here, let's consider the 4th chapter of the Gospel of John. This narrative provides us an instructive example of purity politics at play. Jesus encounters a Samaritan woman at the well. Jews in both Judea and Galilee viewed Samaritans with contempt. But interestingly enough, socially and culturally, it's more accurate to think of Judeans and Samaritans as interrelated rather than as arch enemies. I mean, they both adhered to a strict monotheism. They both practiced male circumcision and adherence to the Torah. But sometime during the 5th century, during the Persian reign, Samaritans decided that the temple did not belong in Jerusalem, but rather on Mount Gerizim in the city of Shechem, the original capital of the United Kingdom of Israel. And this distinction alone was enough to cause the Jewish elite in Jerusalem to render the Samaritans aberrant and deviant. Psychotherapists refer to this dynamic in Freudian terms, a narcissism of minor differences. This is to say, when competing communities share adjoining territories and other attributes, they engage in constant battle and ridicule as a means of emphasizing what they believe makes them unique. No matter how much Galileans and Judeans exaggerated their differences with Samaritans to preserve their own kind of sense of distinctiveness, at the end of the day, it's easier to think of Jews and Samaritans as interrelated rather, again, than enemies. But the more we see ourselves in the perceived other, the more likely we are to keep projecting our own evil thoughts and vain desires upon that evil other. This is an example of purity politics run amok. And to be sure, No society is immune. No society is free of purity politics. Every community, country, religious faith tradition has its ways of establishing social hierarchies based upon who or what is deemed appropriate. In the cultural stages of public performance, those in power assign people to particular roles. Consider the history of Christianity in the Americas. Recall the mass extermination of native populations in the 16th century, an indigenous population that for pecuniary reasons, it was all too easy to just label those folks heathens. And so under the direction of the Spanish crown and with the blessing of Pope Alexander VI, the Spaniards unleashed what historian Luis Rivera Pagan calls a violent evangelism. A violent evangelism that reduced the native population from around 80 million in 1500 to 10 million in just 50 years. Or consider the enslavement of Africans in the North Atlantic slave trade. Besides the enslaved being carried on ships with names like Hope and Jesus, Christian theologians developed entire theological systems that justify enslavement based on race. If the people of Africa were deemed a cursed race, either the divinely cursed descendants of Ham or representatives of a deficient form of humanity that the ancient philosopher Aristotle conceived of as natural slaves, just as Aristotle conceived of women as deficient, underdeveloped men. Then of course we can concretize a 400-year intellectual and visceral global framework of white and male supremacy. As Isabel Wilkerson, as she writes in her most recent book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent. Caste is insidious and therefore so powerful because it's not hatred. It's not even necessarily personal. It's the worn grooves of comforting routines and unthinking expectations, patterns of a social order that have been in place for so long that it looks like the natural order of things. And as more recent history teaches us, periods of social insecurity and strife often drive political and religious leaders to circle the wagons around those considered pure while alienating anybody deemed different. And let me just add that whenever we see examples where people were criminalized based on identity, mass suffering always ensues. In our nation, it was true of the Oriental Exclusion Act of 1924 that set the stage for Japanese internment. It was true of the 1935 Nuremberg laws, which legalized mass genocide of Jews in Nazi Germany. And it was true of the Bantu Education Act of 1953 that formalized racial apartheid in South Africa. Or consider the so-called Nashville Statement drafted in 2017 at the annual conference of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. The statement condemns those who believe that a family can be anything other than a heterosexual married couple adhering to traditional complementarian gender roles between men and women. As the saying goes, the devaluation of one group leads to the ultimate dehumanization of all groups. Or as Anthea Butler articulates so well in her most recent extraordinary work, White Evangelical Racism. Evangelicalism is proven more than simply a religious group. It's a nationalistic political movement whose purpose is to support the hegemony of white Christian men over against the flourishing of others. Well, this, my friends, was the case between Jews and Samaritans. So when Jesus asked her for a drink of water, she responds, "How is it that you, a Jew, can ask me, a Samaritan, for a drink of water?" I don't see this woman as intending to be rude or disrespectful to Jesus. Maybe her response is actually more a matter of surprise than sass. I mean, God only knows what kind of treatment this woman has grown accustomed to from Galilean men and women as they pass through her town. I'm sure she's well aware of the intentional and unintentional slights, the derogatory remarks, the commonplace indignities directed toward her on a daily basis. She probably learned over time to shield her soul from the religious and ethnic aggressions and microaggressions. I can imagine a Galilean father telling his kids to be mindful of Samaritans on their journey through Samaria. Galilean women may have pulled their children closer when Samaritans draw near. Children may have stared curiously while asking, "Is she one of them, Daddy? Those Samaritans?" Or maybe the woman understandably expected something even more sexually dehumanizing when she saw Jesus smile at her. Here comes another one. I'm not good enough for him to marry or take home or even take into the temple, but I'm perfect for an afternoon of sexual fulfillment, she may have thought. For a culture of masculine privilege certainly fueled the world's oldest profession in the area. And when we couple this with details provided about this woman's personal life and relationships with many different husbands, this is what's led many biblical interpreters to mark this woman as a woman of quote unquote ill repute. And this explains why in many Christian communities, the woman at the well has become a euphemism for a modern day sex worker. Interestingly, none of this seems to matter to Jesus. Maybe it didn't matter to Jesus because in his context, maybe Jesus understood that it was quite possible that this woman may have been trapped in what was known as a levirate marriage in the ancient world. This is to say, after the death of multiple spouses, she was not allowed to leave the family, but was just passed down from marriage to the oldest living brother-in-law upon the death of each husband. This was actually quite possible. Maybe this is why Jesus restrained judgment and condemnation and unleashed grace and mercy. Or maybe Jesus just thought, who cares? And let me say, this is what I find so beautiful and instructive about this passage. This passage of text, this section of scripture, this narrative, this story of Jesus having the longest encounter with anyone that he has throughout the Gospels, this woman. I love it because there's no explanation of this woman's circumstances. Those who told the story originally in the Johannine community did not feel the need to explain away this woman's life. I mean, unlike the story of the Good Samaritan, or unlike the Samaritan leper who returned to thank Jesus, this Samaritan didn't have to earn Jesus's compassion. There's no moral clause here. Jesus's treatment of this woman is not predicated on her goodness, unlike the other stories, any more than her marginalization as a Samaritan was based on her sinfulness. How deviant or how holy her personal lifestyle, that's of little consequence. Jesus only sees a woman in desperate need of respect and recognition. It's not about who she is. It's about who he is and who his God is. This is the world we inhabit. A world that's become unapologetically fractured, intentionally estranged, and arrogantly alienated. We've hung hateful labels around the necks of entire marginalized groups. We've built xenophobic walls around our presumed in-groups, and we've entombed our own souls in the burial grounds of cultural bigotry. And now, as much as ever, Our society needs to both hear and see men and women who can bear witness to this Jesus, the one who shares across lines of difference, the one whose power is not defined by rank, position, or financial profit, but rather a capacity to extend empathy and compassion. This is what Jesus models here. And in thinking about this, as I move to my conclusion, I also want to be clear about something else. And that is Jesus's relationship with this woman. It's not about pity. Because even the nature of the dialogue is clear that he has as much to learn from this woman as she does from him. And it's not supercilious, as her humanity and dignity is as valuable as is his own. And it's not transactional, as Jesus isn't seeking anything in return, as the very act of compassion is its own reward. His humanity is affirmed in the affirmation of her humanity and dignity. So if we who understand ourselves to be followers of Jesus are serious and sincere about the language of love, empathy, inclusion, belonging, then we have to be willing to check and challenge our own preconceptions about who belongs where. For as Jesus told his disciples in John 15, you are called to love one another as I have loved you. And that's how people will identify you as my followers. And or how you treat one another and how you treat others will repel people from you. This is our challenge. This is my prayer. And Bryn Mawr Presbyterian, this is my humble plea. I so look forward now to discussing and learning from my dear colleagues and all of you. Thank you.
So I'm going to invite our panelists to turn their videos back on and join us here for a conversation. There we go. Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Walton. The unfortunate part about being virtual in this way is that we can't give you a rousing applause and thank you and express our gratitude for your presentation. So we all do that with you here. I'm going to invite Reverend Marshall to go first, but before she starts, just to remind folks that the Q&A should be open. And so if you have questions that you want Dr. Walton and the panelists to talk about as well, to go ahead and send those. I'll see those and then offer them up to the group. So Reverend Marshall.
Well, I want to begin by just extending gratitude for this conversation and understanding how critical it is in the place that we find ourselves as a country. And I'm grateful for my brother's work. I am one of those who were part of the chorus of witnesses that saw Dr. Walton defend his dissertation at Princeton Theological Seminary. And it's been an absolute joy to see the ways in which his vocational path is unfolding, how he is doing what Reverend Dr. Katie Cannon called us towards, doing what the work our soul must have. And as I hear him and as I read his writing, I know this is truly soul work. And this soul work that is happening in his life is able to be a gift to the body of Christ. And so I'm so grateful to have a chance to respond and to share this moment. And also with the other distinguished panelists, I already had Dr. Butler's book on my desk when I was called to to be a part of this panel. So just certainly grateful for an opportunity to reflect on what this means. I'm thinking of that word that Paul gives in Romans 8, what shall we say of these things? And so I've been thinking a lot about how this call to put on the lens of love and how the gospel really disrupts those purity politics, and what implications that has for the community of faith, for the church. And so one thing that I've been processing is what implications does the facing these purity politics that Dr. Walton speaks about, what implications does it have upon the life and the work of the community of faith? James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And so for me, I see this work and this lecture as a way for us to receive an invitation to face the ways in which the church has weaponized the scripture to push people to the margins and to perpetuate those purity politics that we often see playing out in the world. And so it's a call to re-examination for truly, if we are to be people who bear witness in the church, certainly if we are to be an alternative reality to the ways in which hierarchies and the way in which white supremacy and other bigotries are set up in the world, we must look within and be able to examine how these things play out in the church. And so I started really looking at, thinking through my own experience as a Black woman, as a clergy woman, and looking at the ways in which some of these politics around who belongs where has played out in my own life. And it made me think about an experience I had in as I was pastoring some years ago, going to see a member at a local hospital. And I had my clergy badge on, and I was walking in, getting ready to see a member, and assuming that I was a part of the personnel of the hospital. There was a lady who came, and she stopped me. She wanted to get some directions. She noticed I had a badge on, but when she saw that it was not a hospital or personnel badge, it was a clergy badge, she stopped in her tracks, and she scanned me up and down. And then in the most incredulous tone, she said, you're a pastor? And I said, yes, ma'am. I was in the South. I was in North Carolina. So I said, yes, ma'am. I'm here to see a member of my church. To which she replied with a grunt, well, you don't look like no pastor. And I smirked, and I just said, well, I guess that assumes what a pastor looks like. I'm not sure that was the most faithful response, but it was the truth for me at that moment. And I walked away, she walked away. And I go back to that experience about how this woman had internalized the patriarchy of her tradition. So to her, I was out of line, I was out of place, I was out of bounds. We were both women, but I had stepped out of the prescribed lines meant to contain me. Another vignette that came to mind as I thought about this idea of who belongs. I was on my way to preach at a church, and I had ended up I was in a place that was unfamiliar. I was a guest preacher, and so I slowed down in this neighborhood. As I drew near close to the church, there was a house that I passed on the way to the church, and the residents of this house had placed a sign in the lawn that said, "Suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence." And those of you may be familiar with that 1 Timothy 2:12 passage. And so I thought, how ironic, as I go to preach, I kept driving to my preaching engagement, and I preached that day fully out of line, fully out of place and out of bounds in the minds of many who had ascribed to that fundamentalist and reductionist reading of 1 Timothy 2:12. And I want to share these stories, not to engender, Dr. Walton talked about, it's not so much about a pity or some kind of rally cry, but I want to share this truth that has taken me years, conscious of the stigmas. It has taken me years to silence the voices that say, I don't belong. What is just as damaging in these oppressive structures and and what is just as damaging in the ways in which purity politics operate is not just the givenness that we assume that they are in our society, but how those who are not who are seen as those who are not to belong, how those structures can be so loud that we start to listen and possibly believe them. So I thought about the implications of Dr. Walton's work with pastoral care. In my work as a pastor with communities who have been pushed to the margins, that there's a trauma that comes alongside harmful readings and practices. There's a trauma that comes with, we heard about that violent evangelism of purity politics. And while I am grateful to be buffeted and supported by my education and resources, I recognize that there are so many people who do not have those social supports. In fact, I'm part of a community of faith in West Philadelphia. We're embedded in an environment where people hear the voices that say your life doesn't belong. We hear it in the ways in which the systems from our health system, our environmental system, our economic system is set up, and the inequities thereof, state-sanctioned violence against Black women and Black men. And so we have an opportunity to refuse to ignore the ways in which these politics are at play in the church and outside the church. And so I'm going to stop there and allow Dr. Butler and Dr. Lawrence to speak. I have a lot more to say, but I want to be mindful of time. So I'll stop there.
Well, and we'll let Dr. Walton, if you want to respond back first, that's great. Or it needs no response.
Well, I don't think it needs much response. I mean, I think the way that she elucidated the varying points that I was trying to capture, both in the ancient world and our world, and what I mean, with those examples that Reverend Marshall described, I mean, they just so fully illumine, right? The ways that, in terms of the ways that our bodies frame us in a particular way, and the way that power, right, seeks to contain and control, right, who belongs where. And so I think that, yes, that was the heart of that sort of message. And it's only in our willingness and our ability to kind of, be self-critical, right? Because these work in all varying kinds of spaces, right? And also what I also really like about the examples that Dr. Marshall gave is the fact that patriarchy knows no gender, white supremacy knows no race, right? I mean, there's varying ways that this plays out, right, in our communities.
Great, thanks. Dr. Butler.
Reverend Kirkpatrick, first of all, for having me today. And thank you to Dean, Reverend Dr. Walton, for an amazing talk. But I want to ask you a different question. And this is where I get to be the person who's always poking him in the ribs and going, but what about? What about what I would call the reality of unintended and intended difference? And the reason why I bring that up is because of something that I read this morning that has been really weighing heavily on me. And it was on Twitter. And it was a story of a young man in India who had procured an oxygen tank for his mother. And she was on, obviously she had COVID, and somebody came and took the oxygen tank who was richer, and they just passed off the oxygen tank to this much more wealthy family. And his mother died within 2 hours. And I've been thinking a lot about this difference that happens when things don't go the way you think that they're going to go. And I'm thinking about the virus here, and I know everybody is tired of this, but I think that we're at a moment right now where we really have to consider this. We have been so consumed with the racial climate in this country, which is really important, but there is also something that is coming that is going to make difference very big. And that is this virus, the difference between who gets vaccinated and who doesn't, the difference between who can afford the health care that they received and who can't and who will go into bankruptcy, the difference between being able to stay at home and continue to work at home vis-a-vis being someone who is an essential worker. And so, or even the ways in which we think about who can come into the country and who can't. Right now, India has been placed on restriction in different spaces around the world, Nigeria, Australia, Canada. Brazil is also the same way because of the rampant spread of coronavirus. America was there last spring and summer into the fall because of the rapid spread here of the virus. And so I'm wondering about how do we talk about Jesus seeing the differences that are not constructed, but the differences that are really real, the differences that construct a certain kind of reality for people, whether or not they participate in them, the kinds of barriers that get put up because of purity or because of race, or the kinds of things that you didn't have any control over, but they made difference. They made a barrier. They made a way in which you have to figure out how are you going to negotiate this barrier. And as a Black woman in my skin, I often feel like the Samaritan woman. I don't feel like I can trust someone when I want to reach out to them. I don't feel like somebody is going to have my best interest at heart. I don't feel like the things that I do are about who I am, but because I fill in a blank as an unintended consequence. And so I wonder about these things, and I wonder, how do we function in a world today that builds up these kinds of differences between people all the time, despite the fact that we don't want to have that difference. We don't want to have those ways in which we create differences. Sometimes the differences are made for us through these unintended consequences and situations that get constructed around us. The story that you've told us about the ancient world vis-a-vis this long history, I think, is really important. But as we go into a world that is both more global, but actually smaller, I wonder how we begin to think about these things. And as an ethicist, I know you think a lot about this. I'm not an ethicist, I'm a historian. I tend to be on the, how shall I say it gently, the pessimistic side of things, because I see history as history. And I don't know, I don't think these people are going to be very good about what they're doing. But I do think there's a value in challenging us today about not just the narcissism of difference, but the ways in which certain ideas, certain structures, certain ways in which the world is turning right now, certain things that we can't control, like a pandemic, make difference amongst us. And how do we manage that difference? How do we, feel okay about somebody around us who doesn't have a vaccine? I know personally, I have to think about that. I have to try to be gentle with people, but I also get angry because I just think, how is it that you can't believe this? How is it that you won't do what is best for everybody else? How is it that you think that you are smarter than science? And so I'm trying to grapple and wrestle with these things right now. And I'm wondering what you might have for us. And this is not a challenge, it's actually really a plea. How can you help us think through this in a way in which we understand that we don't want to, on the one hand, embrace these narcissistic differences, but at the same time realizing that there are forces in our world today that make us have to think about how these differences are created beyond our reach, beyond what we can do, and how do we manage them? And so I'll leave at that and make it short. And you can think about that if you don't want to answer me right now.
No, I don't want to answer you. Look, I think it's the narcissism that's the contributing factor to these unintended and intended differences born of power, right? And so I'm trying to identify a particular strand of the constituent elements of these varying power relations that are exacerbated in times of social conflict, in times of social strife, in times like now born of the pandemic, right? And so actually, we're in absolute agreement regarding that. I mean, of course, we're in agreement anyway in terms of, but this is what I was trying to do with by pointing out the contributing elements that widens and exacerbates the divide. To give as an example, when you were talking, I was thinking about the ways that the pandemic revealed our hypocrisy and disingenuous nature around work and labor. I remember Martin Luther King Jr. saying that there was no such thing as menial labor. There's only menial pay. Okay. And this pandemic, all of a sudden, when we had to start thinking seriously about frontline workers, when we started, and when it was revealed to us in ways that none of us could deny, the very people who make our existence possible are the very people that we actually just a few months ago considered expendable and social junk, right? And so this pandemic, it flips the script on that. And so it therefore puts before us the very sort of epistemic humility that I'm calling for, not just as individuals, that's what I want to be very clear about, but as a society, as a culture. Right? I mean, Albert Camus writes, I mean, in his great book, The Plague, I've revisited during this last 14 months. And Camus says it's not just about what a pandemic does to a society, but it's actually about what a pandemic reveals about the society. And that's what you put your finger on, right? And it's that challenge and call to epistemic humility as a society, as a culture, but then also as individuals, right? Because in the same way that you and Reverend Marshall have to be cautious and careful, right, in who you deal with and in your dealings with others, and you have to be protective, right, for reasons why, because you've got empirical evidence that you've got to protect yourself, right? The fault isn't with you. The fault and the pity is with those who are so anemic by being deprived of healthy, valuable relationships with the two of you. And they're deprived because of the blindness and bias of their own cultural bigotry born of power. Whether it's me as a man, whether it's somebody of a particular economic class, right? And so in the same way, it's this level of our society is proving increasingly anemic intellectually and spiritually because of its own kind of sense of entitlement, its own sense of privilege, its own sense of power, where we don't realize that we're fiddling while the empire is burning, that we're an empire in decay, if you will. Right. So yes, amen, and yes.
Thank you.
Reverend Lawrence.
Well, let me add my thanks to you, Reverend Kirkpatrick, for the opportunity to be in this setting and to listen and to be challenged and moved by your message, Dr. Walton. I want to say that I'm a proud Union graduate, but some of my best friends are from Princeton, and I'm thinking about some good olden days when we used to have intramural basketball games with Princeton. We were the Union revolutionaries going against the Princeton pastors, and I said there's something about that being in that laconic setting that makes you so calm while we were tearing our hair out. But let me get to this to your text. I've not encountered this story by Garcia Marquez before, the handsomest drowned man in the world. And I found something that bothered me about this story. The people that find this dead man washes up on their shore, and he's a handsome man, and they begin to imagine his life, and then their imaginings become real in their own lives, and they begin to better themselves. And I thought about how their imagination about him still doesn't answer the question of who he is, and what is his identity, and what was his story. And it made me think about Jesus and America, because when the majority culture imagines Jesus, they're not imagining a brown-skinned Palestinian Jew living under Roman occupation. They're imagining a blue-eyed, pale-skinned American who is pro-status quo and who is not of low rank, shouldn't be found on a homeless bench. Our culture has such a story to tell about Jesus that's incorrect. And it's so difficult to pull back from our wonderful imaginings to this more correct place. It's difficult to get a film producer to do a movie about Jesus and have Jesus be brown skinned. I'm thinking there's a piece on Netflix called Messiah where Jesus is a Palestinian. That's great. But there's this movie called The Passion that everyone loves, where people speak in Aramaic, yet Jesus is not brown skinned. That's like the final hurdle to be jumped over. We have so told this story that it's difficult for us to get back to the reality. And when you talk about the reality, it gets denied because we like our story. So, and now I'm not an ethicist and I'm not a theologian. I consider myself more of a biblical scholar. And I'm looking at this text. And one of the things that we miss in it, and you can check through the commentaries, there is so much of a focus on the job of this woman. Is she a lady of the night? Is she a streetwalker? Is she a bad Samaritan? There's so much focus on that in the text that we miss her genius. So the fourth chapter comes after the third chapter. The third chapter is Nicodemus. He's a leader. He's in the Sanhedrin. He's educated. And he can't figure out what Jesus is talking about. And Jesus says, you're a leader and you can't figure this out? And here's a woman by the well, and she's theologically sophisticated. She says, you Jews like to worship here in Jerusalem. We like to worship here in Mount Gerizim. Now I'm wondering which one is the right one. She's having a conversation with him about theology. We miss her genius because we are so convinced of her status. And how long has it been that we've tried to pull her out of this image and just listen to her story? She's had multiple husbands, and that's a negative. But if it were a man with multiple wives, that's a harem. There's just so many pieces of the story that we miss because we are so focused on the things that are not true. And the things that are not true are so prevalent in the commentaries and in the text. How do we spoon our way through this stuff, cut our way through this stuff to get back to the story and hear and see her? And I think part of the difficulty is there's a whole lot of the stuff we want Jesus to be and not enough of the other story. I don't have enough of the Samaritan story. I know from the text that I have why they're not liked. It's because they're impure. They've been mixed with Assyrian ancestry. But if I were to be a Samaritan, I would say the people from Judah have been mixed with a Persian Babylonian ancestry, that they come back from that exile with some different stuff. We didn't talk about life after death until you came back. We didn't talk about angels until you came back. You brought Zoroastrianism back with you. You guys are wrong. We're right. I know that the Samaritans had a temple that the Jews destroyed in the 2nd century. We know a lot about the temple in Jerusalem being destroyed. We don't hear much about the Samaritan temple being destroyed. We've got an uneven story here. And the part that we have is so tainted with our vision of what we want Jesus to be that it's hard for us to hear another person's story. And there is another story out there. And it's a great story. Here, with this, I'll stop. here's a story where Jesus goes into Samaria. And my remembrance is that if you were in Galilee, you didn't go through Samaria. You go the long way around. If you did find yourself going through, Samaritans were angry because you were passing by perfectly good worship spots to go to that spot down south. So they didn't like people going south. But after you had visited and you're coming back north, they're much more hospitable, because you notice that Jesus and the disciples, they stop, they go in town, they get something to eat. It's no problem if you're going away. It's the problem coming down. So this woman invites Jesus in this conversation, then goes into town and talks to people. So her reputation must not be so bad, because they listen to her and they come back. And then they say to Jesus, why don't you stay with us 2 days? That's only one verse. What does it mean for 13 Jews to be in Samaria for 2 days, sharing food, sharing fellowship, talking with each other? This is absolutely amazing. But that's not the part of the story that we're interested in. We're interested in the part that identifies her as whatever, and wonder why people talk to her. She came to the well because it was noon. Other people didn't want to talk to her. We don't have any evidence of that, but that's where our vision is. We love the story that we like to tell about the Gospels, not the story that the Gospels are telling.
And that is what makes us so consistent with the earliest communities of Jesus followers. Right? That's part of the humility. Right? That we understand in the same way that the stories that were passed and that were told and that were about Jesus and the communities that were developed, we're talking decades after, and then generations after the actual life of Jesus. Right? And so all of this, and so the reason that I framed that particular text that you're referring to with that story from Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the most beautiful drowned man in the world, is because I was actually trying to set the terms for that level of humility in terms of what's been passed down to us has been that which has been projected back upon this body of Jesus. Now, in terms of listen, I'm just so, the way that you use moral imagination to ethically and responsibly with socio-historical context to reframe and re-narrate a story was absolutely genius, Reverend Lawrence. So let me just say that. And then as it relates to those who only want to tell one side of the story and who then seek to project, where Jesus becomes this green screen of which we can project power upon that green screen. And how communities do that, right? And communities that are notorious for that. I want to recommend, there's this incredible sister that has this book, White Evangelical Racism by Anthea Butler, right? If you have not read this book, this is the book. They asked why it wasn't on my bookshelf. I said, well, because I got it. I've been reading it on Kindle. But I actually, to that point, I mean, I don't mean to put you on the spot, Dr. Butler, but I don't think we can pass this moment and this moment for the way that you just laid that out, Reverend Lawrence, and for us to not engage the tradition of American evangelicalism that's notorious for deploying power, projecting it upon the body of Jesus with specific ends. Is that a good setup, Dr. Butler? Am I reading your work correctly?
You are reading it correctly. there is no other way to read it, honestly. And I think, it reminds me of, I was sort of thinking in your PowerPoint that you could have juxtaposed that Jesus that is on the bench with the Jesus that I often see in a lot of evangelical circles, of Jesus with a gun, or Jesus with the flag wrapped around him, or Jesus, praying behind Donald Trump when he was in office, or these kind of stylized pictures, right, of what we think Jesus is doing in the political realm. And I think that that's really important to think about when we talk about this narcissism, right? This narcissism of how you can think that you marry your religious fervor to the political moment, and that makes you better than anybody else. And I think that's one of the things that I'm trying to get at in this book. When I was reading your book, Lens of Love, you were talking about evangelicalism and abolitionism and all these other things. And I was like, oh, you are the person I'm talking about. And I knew that you weren't.
There
but
is that tradition too.
There is that
There is
tradition
that
too.
tradition.
There is that tradition too. But I felt like what had happened in this particular iteration of where we are with evangelicalism in the last 30 to 50 years is that they've forgotten that tradition, and that they've gone on to the tradition of power and authority and holding it over on everybody else, and the narcissism and the theological narcissism that comes with all of this, that makes it so difficult for them to understand that they have a history of racism. And that is where I think that, like the stories you've told us today, that this particular brand of Christianity right now is really, really at a crossroads, and it may end up in a very bad ditch. And I think my book is a way to say you need to reconsider what your history has wrought.
Indeed. And let me just say, I'll let everybody know on little Reverend Lawrence, if it seems like Dr. Butler and I are going back and forth. When I was writing Lens of Love, I was writing it in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania on sabbatical. And when Dr. Butler was writing this at the same time, and it was often our fights over while watching Dallas Cowboys, Philadelphia Eagles, or the Atlanta Falcons.
I just want to put it out here right now. Anybody who's in love with Dallas Cowboys is a sinner.
I wanted to, some questions have come in that I'm gonna offer up as well, but I wanted to ask my own question that, comes from, our experience as a church who's been trying to navigate some of these conversations, especially over the past year. And I'll be honest, especially in reading Dr. Butler's book as well. And, as you listed out that list of, the different pieces of purity, white, male, American, the thing that that struck me, that I realized shouldn't have been surprising to me, was this sort of reemergence of this label of communist that comes, as soon as we start advocating for the full humanity of all people, that all of a sudden now, I get calls saying I didn't know that Bryn Mawr Presbyterian Church supported communism. And that gets into how we have built Jesus around our own, image, that I try to remind people Jesus maybe was socialist a little bit, so how do we, sort of, I'm interested in Dr. Butler, maybe a little bit of the history of that sort of legacy of linking that, that criticism, but then just sort of for all of you to think about, as we as churches try to navigate this work, how do we combat that criticism?
The short version is as early as 1919 and the racialized summer that happened, that people who the label communist was used to brand people who were for racial justice. And so when we go into the 1950s and you see Billy Graham and shameless self-plug for both Dr. Walton and I, you can see both of us in about 2 weeks on the American Experience talking about Billy Graham. So I should point that out. Billy Graham and his talk about communism may have read one way, and people were afraid of communism in the 1950s because unlike where we are today, they thought of communism as a religion, but it was a religion of no religion. Right? And so that's really important in thinking about that. But the other way you could hear communism during this time period was about people who were fighting for civil rights. And you can think of the House Un-American activities and all of that, and that kind of ethos that permeated the 1950s and the fear of communism and the fears of all of this. But King got called a communist because he was for civil rights. Anybody who was doing civil rights got called as a communist. Now replace today with socialism and you get the same kind of thing. If you see somebody say, oh, there's socialism, oh, there's this, you want socialism because you want healthcare, you're a socialist because you want better wages or all of these things. This is the same kind of epithet that's used, but without understanding what these principles are. And that's the worst part of all. And so when people call up your church and say that you're communist, you'd say, can you tell me a little bit about Karl Marx? That's the response that you give them. And if they can't quote you anything from the Communist Manifesto, hang up on them.
I don't know, Dr. Walton, if you have anything else to add to that, but that is helpful.
Well, I mean, one of the things, and again, I think it's in your second chapter, Anthea, where you trace kind of this history with Billy Graham and others and the John Birch Society, and all of these people that are throwing around the epithets of godless communism, right? And using Christianity, America, freedom interchangeably, and then using communism, godlessness, and tyranny interchangeably, right? But all of the ones who are using Christian, freedom, America, liberty are the very ones that are working to shut down any aim of a multiracial, multi-gender democracy in American society. Right? And so once again, it's this kind of projection of one's own kind of ethical interiority upon a projected evil other. It's a projection on this kind of constructed evil other, right? That often we see really within the recesses of the movement, the very things that they were, quote unquote, decrying, right? And so, yeah, that was one of the just really brilliant moments and brilliant moves, Professor Butler, of that second chapter.
Thank you.
Sure.
So we're getting a lot of the questions.
And I just want to say, and I'm sorry, let me just say this. Let me just say this, right? I mean, and if being in favor of human affirmation, if being in favor of radical inclusion and radical empathy, if being in favor of a multiracial democracy, if being in favor of actually calling into question gender complementarianism that creates these unjust hierarchy that marginalizes and minoritizes women, if being in favor of all of those things somehow or another causes people to hurl insults my way, then guess what? I'm fine with that. Y'all can take Barabbas, right? Y'all can take the Barabbas of inequality, of injustice, and intolerance, right? But my reading of the gospel actually puts me with the one that told a parable in terms of those who were at the banquet table who thought they deserved a space there. They can leave. But for all who have been villainized and victimized, go find them and let them know that there's plenty good room here at God's table.
Mm-hmm. A bunch of go ahead, Eustacia, please go ahead.
You know, from the perspective of the church, I think what Dr. Butler and Dr. Walton are saying is extremely critical, as they are actually mapping where these ideologies and these perspectives come from. And so part of the work of the church is to name the problem. And so when Dr. Butler says, you know, ask them if they read Karl Marx, I mean, that's real, because the part of advocacy, a change, transformation, living into this work is to have the courage to tell the truth about where these things derive from and to draw people's awareness to it. I think that's so important. There's I think it's Levinas has this idea of totalism, about how our imagination is so monopolized by the current ways or the givenness of the hierarchies and the purity politics that we have inscribed into social structures and institutions, that we can't really even imagine the possibility that that all people that can come to the table in an equitable way, that tells us a problem. That's a big problem. And I think to name that problem and to draw it out and to name where it shows up in our churches is important, because how can the church bear witness to what it means to follow Jesus, who calls us, who talks to the Samaritan woman, and she becomes that first preacher who totally subverts those hierarchies? How can we follow if we are actually embedded in the same kinds of logics that are used to continue to push people to the margins? So I think just somebody might say, well, how, what can we do? Well, this is one thing. Naming it is important, because that will then allow us to open up a pathway for transformation.
I saw a couple of questions, Reverend Kirkpatrick, in there. I can't answer all of them, but I just saw one that jumped out, or two that jumped out at me. One was about kind of to one tribe of white evangelicals who they say, I didn't own slaves, and therefore, I just kind of, taught not to see color. That's just not the way that privilege works in a society formed and shaped by hierarchies, right? That's just not the way the privilege works. And so the reason that I had, for example, these kind of, these varying kind of normative conceptions, whether it's white, whether it's male, whether it's heterosexual, American, wealthy, formally educated, right? These are all categories in and of themselves that can stand free and clear. But of course, when combined with one another, right? They serve as a kind of compound interest of principle. But that doesn't mean that they can't stand free and clear with one another, right? And so when one says something like, I didn't own slaves, well, we think about what W.B. Du Bois calls the wages of whiteness, right? In his book, Black Reconstruction, right? That there's a certain wage and certain benefit of being white in a society that has been so constructed, right, to benefit white people, particularly white men, right? And if we somehow think that, for instance, whether it's 150 years of emancipation, 50 years since a kind of second reconstruction of the civil rights movement, right? 100 years celebrating women's right to vote, right? I mean, this is such a short time on the arc of American culture and identity, right? And to think that any of us are not benefiting from that, right? That's like me saying, well, I never owned a woman, but I don't benefit from male privilege, right? And so it's that level of just self-awareness and self-criticism that we all have to have in our varying forms and in our varying sliding scales of social power, of which we all occupy, including those of us who are on this panel. There's a certain amount of social privilege and cultural capital that we have, the very fact that we're all on this panel together. I can't ignore that. I can't obscure that. And so it's at some point, it just comes down to a level of truth telling. And then someone else put in the question, and I really appreciate the question about tying this to the crucifixion, tying our conversation to the crucifixion. Right? And I know that could be done many ways. It could be, for example, we could talk about the power of racism, or we could talk about state-sanctioned violence from the perspective like Billy Graham did, Dr. Butler, and it's only Jesus, and it's only through the redeeming work of Jesus, right, that we'll all be saved and delivered. Well, that's one way of doing. But another way of doing it is actually, what do we learn from, and how do we empathize, and how do we understand the varying structures of power and empire that put not only Jesus, but sometimes up to 2,000 people on a cross per day in the name of defending that empire. And Jesus being a victim of state-sanctioned violence. in such a way that we begin to look at the bread and the wine, where we do this in remembrance. Not only might we think about a bread and wine, maybe we think about an alleged counterfeit $20 bill. Or Ahmaud Arbery at a water hose at a house while out jogging. Or an Arizona iced tea and Skittles. These are all symbols of people who lost their lives as a result of state-sanctioned power, judicial and extrajudicial violence, based upon people who were perceived to be out of their place, just like a Palestinian Jewish teacher named Jesus.
I want to take time for two more questions. One is very broad and one is very narrow. So we'll start with the narrow and we'll end with the broad. One is a question to ask you all to comment on the Southern Baptist Convention condemning the teaching of critical race theory at their seminaries, and how might you critique that? I'm sure you have a critique for that, how you critique that position. Dr. Walton, you.
Please, Dr. Walton, go ahead.
I would say the criticism was in the announcement itself. You had an announcement, I think it was six. It was six white men in a photograph denouncing critical race theory. I mean, can you be any less self-conscious than that as it relates to the projection of power and privilege? Okay. Why? Because what would critical race theory do? It would actually call into question, back to Reverend Marshall's point, it would call into question the very logics that created the conditions for one's announcement in one's own place in the first place. Right. I mean, that's, so I don't have to go much further than that as it relates to the merits, because I want to save that for others on the call.
See, go back to pre-Civil War, when there's one Baptist convention in the United States, well, one denominational convention for everybody, and all these denominations split north and south over the issue of slavery. Yet critical race theory, they don't understand. One of the things that makes me most frustrated is when people use terminology without having conversation about what it means. So there's conversation back and forth about the word critical race theory, but let's have a real conversation about what we're talking about. Because when we break it down into its pieces, you get more assent on all of these individual pieces than the way that it's been presented. We keep having conversations about conversations instead of conversations about content.
But that's the jig, right?
Yeah.
That's exactly what the jig is about. Let's have a conversation about this. Look over here. This is what my book is totally about, is look at the politics of this morality and what it's actually really doing. And this is really important to say. Disclaimer, I will be in the 1619 book that is out this November. But one of the things that people have been upset about is the ways in which the 1619 Project and other historical projects have uncovered and centralized the history of slavery in America. And so the problem becomes not just critical race theory, but the kinds of constructed histories that the Southern Baptists and other evangelicals and everybody else have constructed about what they believe this nation is and their relationship to the nation, okay? And so while we can talk about the Southern Baptists, you need to understand that it's not just the Southern Baptists right now. It's the state of Missouri telling you what you can teach. It is all these other laws that are coming in tandem with the laws that don't want Black people to vote. Let me help you understand very clearly where we are right now, folks. There are a group of people in this country who want to take us back to the 1700s, not even the 1950s anymore, because the 1950s would be a little bit better, not so much better, but they actually really want to drag us back to the past, where women, where Black people, where people of color, and everyone else has to be subject to white male patriarchy. And that is wrong. The problem with the Southern Baptists right now is that the Southern Baptists are losing their Black congregations, and they're also losing the women because of complementarianism and their stance on racism right now. And so I think that what is happening with them is a microcosm of also the kinds of political strategies that you see right now that evangelicals are using in this country.
And so the panel has said it. I just think that we have to raise a question to those who condemn. The question for me is, or maybe it's a point. Here's the problem. There's no acknowledgement of context. That there's no acknowledgement that your perspective, the perspective of many ways in which the Bible has been read, even our theological positions, those that which is seen as normative has often been rendered by white males. And if we will not, it goes back to what Dr. Walton said about self-consciousness. If we will not own that or see that, it is very hard to actually be in conversation with one another. If we do not value other people's perspectives, cosmologies, and acknowledge that there are alternative ways of seeing the world based on people's real experiences, that is part and parcel to the problem. That's why we need a lens of, I mean, that's how white supremacy works. And so I think it's important to just lift up the problem of seeing these kinds of orthodoxies as the only way, the only perspective. Like Dr. Brian Blunt says that it's interpreting scripture and in our theological perspectives. Some of us think that it's like a bone that's buried in sand, that somehow if we have the right shovel, we'll all dig up the same, dig in the ground and get the same bone. Like there's only one bone, there's only one experience, there's only one truth. And that's just not true. That's just not true. And so I think it's important for us to just continue to raise that point for our siblings here.
When Reverend Marshall and I were in seminaries, even when we would in theology, introduction to theology courses, it was theology, and then they had a section called contextual theology, and that's where we would Black theology, majorista, feminist, and varying forms of liberation theologies was framed in this terms of contextual theology, right? And again, what something like critical race theory does, right, like feminist theory, is to say, you know what, all of this takes place in context. That's Reverend Marshall's point that I so appreciate, right? It's all of a sudden James Cone, Katie Cannon, right? They were writing theology in a context, but Martin Luther and John Calvin, Karl Barth, somehow they were just capturing and conveying transcendent ideas of the divine. No. Okay. And so one diminishes one's own intellectual merit of one's own contributions when one doesn't take seriously the context. And I also guess I would say that as it relates to, in terms of thinking about critical race theory and what others can learn from it, because one becomes blinded by one's own ideologies to one's own detriment. We think about something like the Civil War in this country and the way that the Southern states decided to rebound by creating this narrative of the lost cause about themselves, where they reframed the entire narrative of the Civil War, what led to the Civil War, hoisted themselves up in kind of Abrahamic biblical traditions as if they were men of honor, protecting women of honor. It's about states' rights, totally obscure the issue of slavery, yet while using this in order to derail and dismantle the attempt of a multiracial democracy called Reconstruction. Well, with that narrative, what did you just do? You actually just erased the history of which 750,000 people in this nation lost their lives in the Civil War over the issue of one group having the right to own another group. 750,000. And so not only is it an insult to the descendants of the enslaved Black folk, it's an assault to white America. It's an assault on white America. And that is where, and so that is where my expanded conception of empathy even takes me sometimes. And that I hope that it can take me even more. That white supremacy, male supremacy, heterosexism, all of these varying things that we're talking about. Yes, I'm not putting them on equal par. I want to be very clear about that. But not that it's just about what it's doing to demonize the other, but the ways that it's dehumanizing us in the process.
Well, the last time, I'm mindful of the time, and the last question that I kind of wanted to pose is too broad to really be answered, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And that's really about what, and I know, as a congregation, we, are stumbling through these issues together and, earnestly trying to educate ourselves and be a community that celebrates difference and is welcoming and, all these kinds of things, but, we struggle. And I guess I'm interested in hearing, and folks have asked questions that I think get at this question of, what is the church called to do in this moment on the ground, to impact this, to teach people to approach not just the text, but to approach the world with a lens of love. What is this moment calling the church to right now, especially as we think about, any of us serving in churches right now, we're trying to figure out about using the language instead of inviting people back to church, inviting people forward to church, right? And so what in this moment, as we consider churches even coming back to being together, how do we say, what have we come back for? Right? We have come back to do this work together. And so what do you imagine that work looks like? Nobody knows. Reverend Marshall, we're going to do it together.
I'm going to give voice, let somebody else give voice. But, my first thought, Rebecca, is the response will be different for different churches, because even churches really find themselves in very different contexts and situations, and so that's one thing. And so with that means that there needs to be some wrestling with the question in terms of how where your church is and the particularities and the pragmatics. I mean, those are some of the pieces that I think are assumed, but I think it's important to say, because it will be different for different churches in terms of how we address many of the things that Dr. Walton is talking about, and the ways in which we have been really complicit with the purity politics and these biblical interpretations that are often weaponized against people in the margins. I think we need to start looking at how we've been complicit in terms of just a response to this. It's hard to own complicity in any context. It's hard to, we have a kind of a preoccupation with the messianic leader that's going to come and rescue us. And I'm not talking about Jesus. I'm talking about, that person who's going to come and help our church to grow and turn our church around and help us answer the questions of poverty. And we are preoccupied with looking outside of ourselves. And part of that is probably formed in our theology a little bit, especially as Presbyterians who believe in the sovereignty of God, the grace of God, and then I think about that Jesus will work it out song. It's like, we're gonna look outside ourselves. We're gonna find that other figure to save us and rescue us. And the problem is that we don't understand and own our own human agency. Jesus shows us how to be human and how to be in relationship with other people, and gives us the path, in context, depending on where we are, to really imagining and thinking about ways that we can be good neighbors to one another, that we can act with compassion and justice and kindness. And so I think that we have to learn to be okay with some of our uncertainties and big ambiguities and wrestle with them until we dig out that which we are called to do as a particular people of faith. This is, some of you know, I'm serving a church, New River. It is, I think Reverend Kirkpatrick said that it's formation of 3 historic churches, collectively almost 500 years of history. We are in that process of answering, of figuring out what are the gifts, the capacities, the assets, what has God called us to steward in our congregation, in our community, that we might use these gifts to be of service and of good neighbors to those in West Philadelphia. Nobody can answer that for us. We will have to continue to look at what those gifts, those capacities, those graces are that we have, that we will use them to be of service. So I just think that part of this is really doing that introspection and contextual asset mapping for each congregation. What do we have? And then also, it's also issue identification, which doesn't come with an idea of like, well, the community needs this, so I'm going to go and I'm going to open up, I'm going to do this program because the community needs it. But it comes with actually being in conversation with people in the community who will tell you what are the needs, what are the concerns, and then with those voices, those elders in the community, those workers in those who are part of the matrix that form the communities and neighborhoods we have, that information coupled with our own gifts and assets, we can, there's partnerships and collaborations and wonderful things that can happen. And so I think also part of this is also getting in dialogue and getting having those conversations. I think Bryn Mawr is on that journey. I know Reverend Kirkpatrick and I have been having that conversation, but I think it's important to continue to walk in that journey as we continue forward.
I'm going to give an answer, because everybody wants to always, tell us what to do, tell us what we're going to do, tell us what we should do, right? So I'm going to do that right now, right? With a answer, not the answer, but an answer. And that is communities of faith, churches, local congregations, and institutions of theological education have to do, and we need to continue to do, a better job of leveraging one another. Congregations. So often I hear from religious leaders that leave seminary and leave divinity school, they say things, Reverend Lawrence, like, well, I never learned this in seminary, divinity school never taught me this, right? I never learned this. This wasn't offered. Often, actually, we could usually look at the curriculum and say, you know what, it actually was offered when you were there, but you didn't take it, which is fine. You know why? Because sometimes we don't know what we need. We don't know what we don't know until we need it. And so, therefore, but I'm not just talking about a kind of a slim continuing education here. I'm talking about a robust engagement, because another thing I hear from clergy and community leaders, congregational leaders, man, it seems like y'all have all these great conversations, to Reverend Marshall's point, about issues, about these really contested, complicated matters that we are afraid to touch in the local church. You're right, because we're theological education. We offer a particular conceptual safe space. that we have to do a better job of inviting communities into. At the same time, we also must acknowledge as theological educators that you are doing the heavy lifting on the ground. You, Reverend Lawrence, you, Reverend Kirkpatrick, you, Reverend Marshall, y'all are doing the heavy lifting and negotiations with people of a range of different perspectives in your communities that y'all are trying to keep together. Okay? And you have access to these people. We have resources, you have resources, you have access. Okay? And I think whether it's conversations like this one, and not just the conversations, but thinking constructively about what we might be able to build together. There are some things that pastors do not have the freedom to do that theological educators do. And there's many things that pastors just know how to do that theological educators are clueless to. That's probably why a lot of us became theological educators. And so I think the ways that we could leverage one another, because if we understand in people who are in my role, that we're not just here to give people imprimaturs, not just stamp a degree, not just, credentialize, but no, we understand the work that we're doing as a call to ministry, as a vocation. Then we have to work with the partners who are doing the heavy lifting, and that's you. Okay. And I think that is, because communities of faith are only benefit when they're able to hear from the kind of genius of a Dr. Butler, right? And in the same way, right, when Reverend Marshall and Reverend Lawrence can get a Dr. Butler and take somebody of her skill and intellectual acumen and get her out interfacing with people in the ways that she is uniquely situated to do, I think that's when we're making real traction, and we're, as we say down here, we're cooking with grease.
I'll be brief. I just want to echo what my colleagues have said. This idea of collaboration and conversation is essential. It's basic, and it really is what we don't do. I'm also a graduate and associated with Eastern University here in St. David's near Pennsylvania, and Palmer, the seminary connected with that, has been doing some things in the Black community over the last couple of years that are just offering opportunities for people to hear great presentations from preachers and theologians, gather them together and see what happens when that happens. There is still this piece, all this mythology about what happens when you go to seminary, and the lack of good communication about how these two institutions can work together rather than accuse each other. Churches get nervous when seminaries start talking radical stuff because it feels like we're moving away from orthodoxy. We need to sit down and have that conversation and not be so scared of hearing the truth from a lot of different spots. And theological institutions need to be careful about where the money's coming from. These people are going to stop sending us money if we sound too much over here or too much over there. How can we sit down with them and say, we are exploring scripture, and this exploration is going to take us into some uncomfortable places, but we're going to still believe in Jesus and still love God. So hang with us and let's make this move, rather than divorce each other when it looks like you are just a little bit too far away from where we want you to be comfortably. Mm-hmm. It's got to be more collaboration and more conversation.
Mm-hmm. You all are giving away my secret that anytime I want the church to hear something, I just bring in a scholar to tell them, because I know they won't hear it from me. So now the secret is out. But Dr. Butler, I'll let you have the final word.
The final word is just one word: change. You have to be ready for change, because none of this is going to be the same. It just isn't. Everything that we've looked at, whether you're looking at the Pew Forum or other places, the ways in which churches are changing, the demographics are changing, the numbers are changing. You have to be willing to change. And I think if you try to hold on to the past too much, you won't be able to go into the future and do the things that, you need to do as a community and as a congregation if you're not willing to make changes.
Mm-hmm. That's a good last word and helpful. what I think is hopefully a hopeful word about how we do this into the future. I cannot say enough how grateful I am to all of you, to Dr. Walton for being with us for the whole weekend, but for Reverend Marshall and Reverend Lawrence and Dr. Butler spending this afternoon with us. Even in these unfortunate pandemic circumstances, this has been a remarkable conversation that I know our church will reap the benefits of for a long time into the future. And so I'm so grateful for all of you and grateful for everyone who was able to be with us today and have this conversation. So thank you all so very much. Thank you.